This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on Prime Minister's message from Raisina Dialogue to the world. The participants are Ashok Sajjanhar, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
The Prime Minister reached out to the world community as he also talked about India's role, and he also specifically said that India has walked the talk on helping the world countries in the coronavirus pandemic despite its limited resources. The PM also went on to say that India today understands that mankind will not defeat the pandemic unless all of us, regardless of the color of our passports, come together. Ambassador Sajjanhar, when we see the Prime Minister's outreach to the world community and to the world leaders, and also explaining the initiatives that India has taken, how do you look at this message that he has put out to the world community, in a way partly explaining India's role and also explaining how India has played its part and, as the PM said, walked the talk?
I think the Prime Minister, what he really sought to do through the keynote address at the Raisina Dialogue was basically to suggest that what the world has been doing for the last 70 years is not being the correct approach. Because the approach soon after the end of the Second World War was to build institutions so that there would not be a Third World War. And he said that approach had been wrong because I think he raised some very fundamental questions. And he said that the approach should have been as to how can the problems of the world in terms of poverty, in terms of inequity, in terms of climate change, and the other challenges that afflict the world, how can those be resolved? And in that context, he said that the world has failed to come together to deal with this and what the world needs to do now. And I think his address was both thought-provoking, it was incisive, as also it was extremely inspirational and motivating, because he said that although there is this challenge of the pandemic, but this challenge can be converted into an opportunity by embarking on a human-centric approach. And this is what he said, like when he mentioned that when you have some plan, the first option might be a plan A, the second might be a plan B. But as far as the Earth is concerned, there is no planet B, there's only planet Earth. So we have to save the planet Earth by coming together. And his approach was that of multilateralism, that is, of all countries coming together and trying to bring world together for the benefit of each and every one. So I think basically he was mentioning that multilateralism has been a failure so far, and these fissures and these fractures have become very evident. And the only way to deal with this is that the whole world should come together as India has done. The role that India has played in terms of reaching out to the world, notwithstanding its rather limited resources, but it has tried to do that, and much more needs to be done, and India is ready in following this human-centric approach.
Ambassador Sajjanhar, as you pointed out, the PM very specifically also said that the world was underprepared for the COVID-19 pandemic. He pointed out to the post-Second World War order, and in which we had the United Nations and other multilateral structures that he had said had been created only to prevent the Third World War. And the Prime Minister said that we should have instead focused on hunger, poverty, and humanitarian issues. How relevant do you think this is, and how much does this cut across to the global community? Because we do see that while we have the pandemic, for example, we do have a lot of issues, a lot of politicking still going on. So when the Prime Minister has correctly pointed out that maybe our emphasis needs to be hunger, poverty, and humanitarian issues, how much do you think the message actually reaches across and the world leaders are willing to step aside their political differences and come together and give a united response to the pandemic?
I think the Prime Minister raised some very basic and very fundamental questions. And if the world does not heed it, it will be at its own peril that the world will not be paying adequate attention to it. You are very right when you say that the Prime Minister mentioned that the focus had been just on avoiding the Third World War, and that in an age of competition, the spirit of cooperation has been forgotten. So whatever we need to do going forward, it can be achieved only through having a cooperative approach. And also that the concern for the welfare of humanity has been left behind. These are important aspects which the world needs to weave into its approach as we move forward if we are to deal not only with the pandemic of today. As he said, it was the institutions that were created after the Second World War were not to fight the wars that will come ahead, but they were to fight the wars that had already gone by. So the challenges that are coming, as the Prime Minister had said, were of hunger, he mentioned inequity, he mentioned injustice, he mentioned terrorism. And I think these are the issues, also climate change, that we will need to deal with by the whole world coming together. If every country wants to handle these issues as they have been doing so far, I don't think they will be able to meet with success. You mentioned about Europe. You look around anywhere in the world, what we speak about vaccine nationalism, that although the countries are small, if they are developed countries, they are hoarding vaccines. They are not allowing vaccines to be shipped out. While a country like India, even before the vaccine came onto the scene, India had gone out to more than 150 countries, and it had supplied the PPEs, it had supplied medicines, other equipment like ventilators, like masks, and within its limited resources, it had shared its experience, it had shared its expertise, and also the resources with the rest of the world. And even now, as far as the vaccines are concerned, although we have a huge task in front of us to vaccinate all our people, but still India has reached out soon after the vaccination was kicked off in the country by supplying now to more than 80 countries the vaccines that have been manufactured in India. So I think he set this out as an example that no one is safe unless everyone is safe, particularly as far as the pandemic is concerned.
Mr. Sajjan, we have seen that since January 21st, the government has allowed the supply of 6.51 crore doses of the two India-made vaccines, of which more than 1 crore are donations or grants from India to 90 countries worldwide. And we followed the news of the vaccine Maitri, how India has helped out smaller nations while we are also vaccinating people here in our own country. How do you think that this becomes an example by which India leads the world? For example, showing that while there are priorities at home, India is also doing its bit globally, and this also puts India somewhere in a global leadership role, that while India is of course fulfilling its own domestic priorities, we have also made it a point to reach out to the world in general.
That sense has really emerged as a role model as far as the world is concerned on this issue of the vaccines. Because if you look at the responses of most of the world leaders who received these vaccines, for instance, when the vaccines were received by Bhutan, the Prime Minister of Bhutan said that it is truly commendable that when India is required to vaccinate such huge numbers within its own country, that it has the generosity and the large heart to share its resources with other countries. There are, of course, accounts of the Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro welcoming the vaccines from India and calling it the Sanjeevani being brought by Hanuman to cure the people of Brazil. There is also the instance of the President of Dominican Republic, Roosevelt Skerrit, who said, I have read in Bible that when you pray, your prayers are always answered. But I never realized that my prayer for vaccines would be answered so very quickly, so very promptly. So I think the world over, whether it is the UN Secretary General, whether it is Director General of the WHO, all of them have spoken extremely highly and applauded the actions of the Indian government in reaching out, and particularly to providing these vaccines to the developing countries of the world under the WHO's COVAX program, and also within our neighborhood. In fact, the first vaccines that went out of India were to Bhutan and Maldives on the 20th of January. We started our own vaccination drive on the 16th. Within 4 days, they went to these two countries. Then on the 21st, we supplied 2 million doses to Bangladesh, 1.5 million doses to Nepal, and so on and so forth. So I think whether it is our neighborhood or developing countries, That has been our priority, because otherwise, if India had not gone out to them, many of them would have really been left behind.
Ambassador Sajjanhar, as the PM said, that mankind will not defeat the pandemic unless all of us, regardless of the color of our passports, come out of it. Do you think that this is a good enough argument to then counter the critique that one is also getting to hear that maybe India was sending out more? Because this is at the end of the day a very global problem. So one cannot be safe unless your neighbor is safe. So tying in the diplomatic fact and also the humanitarian fact, do you feel that the Prime Minister has said yesterday and the vaccine Maitri is actually a diplomatic win-win for India?
You would recall that when the Prime Minister in his keynote address at the Raisina Dialogue, he said that the world has to follow a human-centric approach. So if India itself does not follow, then the words do not carry much credibility. And this is what the Prime Minister said, that you have to walk the talk. You would also recall that in September last year, when the Prime Minister was addressing the UN General Assembly, he had said that India is the pharmacy of the world, India is the vaccine center of the world, and whatever capacity India has to manufacture vaccines, it will be utilized not only for its own population, but it will be utilized to help the whole of humanity and the whole of mankind. And this is the message that had been sent out, whether when our Foreign Secretary traveled to Bangladesh or when our senior leaders traveled to Nepal or to Sri Lanka, that as soon as India gets the vaccine, then supply of vaccine to our neighbors will also be a matter of priority. And India has truly done what promised to do, what it had committed to do. And I think this would have raised the persona and the profile and the image of India amongst the people and amongst the countries of the world in a very significant manner.
Ambassador Sajjanhar, we saw that the Prime Minister spoke at the Raisina Dialogue. It's a 4-day conference where the Rwandan President, the Danish Prime Minister, the Australian Prime Minister, and the President of the European Council have also been attending. And the Prime Minister also said that this is a watershed moment in human history. When we look at this statement, is it also somewhere reminding the world that maybe this is now a wake-up call for humanity and for all of us basically as how to deal with future pandemics and about our responses? And more importantly, when the PM says this, it is also pointing out to our own responses and how India has led by example and not just by dialogues, but we've actually shown how to deal with the pandemic.
Two aspects that he referred to, Simran. One was that this sort of a pandemic comes once in a century. The last time that the world had to contend with this, confront a pandemic of this nature, it was in 1918, so exactly 100 years ago. And secondly, what are the institutions that were created after the Second World War that they have been found quite inadequate to deal with the challenge that the world is confronting today. So if the failures have been so visible and so evident, what is it that the world needs to do? And in that he said that the world needs to come together. In fact, what I found inspirational as far as the Prime Minister's keynote address is concerned, that he acknowledged that it is a challenge. But what he said was that it can be created, it can be converted into an opportunity. And in that context, he gave the example of India, how India has been able to deal with it. And also, I think this was a message to the whole world that if we do not cooperate, if we do not collaborate, if we do not work together, if we do not follow a human-centric approach, then it will be at the peril of the world and its system. We have to change the institutions appropriately so that human being comes at the center of those and not economics and profit making as has been done so far.
And Ambassador Sajjanhar, we bring today's talk to an end with a reminder of what the PM has said to the world, and he has reached out and reminded everyone that regardless of the color of our passports, humanity and mankind will not defeat the pandemic unless all of us come together. Thank you.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on Prime Minister's message from Raisina Dialogue to the world. The participants were Ashok Sajjanhar, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our website, newsonair.com. You may email opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.